Hi, everybody. My name is Shannon Kowalski. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Policy with the International Women's Health Coalition. First off, I wanted to let you know there's interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. So please choose your channel. We will have some of our colleagues speaking in Spanish today. And if you're listening in French, please note that there might be a slight delay in the French interpretation. I also wanted to let you all know that this session is being recorded. And will be shared with journalists after the fact who were not able to attend. So I'm going to give it 1 or 2 more minutes and then we will get started. Okay, so welcome. I'm Shannon Kowalski. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Policy with the International Women's Health Coalition. I'm very grateful to be joined today by a number of my fellow advocates who are representing the Women's Rights Caucus. And the Women's Rights Caucus was established in 2013. It's a coalition of more than 200 feminist and women's rights organizations that are pushing for progress on gender equality at the UN Commission on the Status of Women. In a moment, I'll introduce each of our speakers for a brief 3-minute intervention on our priorities for this year's CSW and our expectations for the agreed conclusions, which are being negotiated as we speak. Throughout the call, you can enter your questions directly into the chat box, and we'll answer as many of them as we can. And as I mentioned at the top, there is language interpretation on this call, so please select your language, English, Spanish, or French. So the negotiations, as I mentioned, are still ongoing at the CSW. There are a number of issues that are still under discussion, but I wanted to take a minute to highlight at the top a few key ideas from the Commission so far. So this year's theme, as you all know, focuses on women in public life and equal participation in decision making. So we're watching the agreed conclusion negotiations very, very closely. And we hope to see an outcome document that addresses public life and decision-making at all levels and in all forms, that is inclusive of the diverse experiences of all women and girls, regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, their disability, employment, HIV status, race, financial or social status, as well as whether they're migrants, internally displaced or Indigenous. We're also expecting that the commitments are matched by action. So while we push for strong agreements at the Commission on the Status of Women, we also push for our own governments to follow through on their words at the CSW with strong action at home, including the mobilization of public resources. And I will note that the Generation Equality Forum is coming up next week in Mexico, and that's a good opportunity for governments to make good on the commitments that they're making here at the Commission. Additionally, we have been pushing as a caucus for the Commission on the Status of Women to be more inclusive and accessible to women and girls, especially in this virtual format. As we've navigated the Commission this year, it's been incredibly challenging, particularly for those that lack access to technology or secure internet sources. The time zone changes and other challenges have meant that this Commission on Status of Women, well, it should have been the most accessible ever, was out of reach for many. Civil society also needs to be a key voice in these negotiations. With all virtual meetings, if governments don't elect to include civil society organizations in their delegation, then these voices really are left out. And UN Women must do more as well to ensure meaningful engagement of civil society in these processes. So now I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Sahar Moazami. She's the UN Program Officer from Outright Action International, who will speak more about diversity and inclusion in the CSW outcome. Sahar, over to you.
Thank you so much, Shannon. And thank you to everyone who is on the line and joining us today. As Shannon mentioned, my name is Sahar Moazami, and I'm a UN program officer at the organization Outright Action International, NGO working to promote and protect the rights of LGBTIQ people globally. And also we have the pleasure of serving as one of the Women's Rights Caucus co-conveners. One area that I want to touch on I just want to reiterate from Shannon's introductory remarks and of vital importance to the Women's Rights Caucus is acknowledging that women are not a homogenous group. Women, girls, and people have varying sexual orientations, gender identities, races, religions, social and financial backgrounds, and many other characteristics which influence how they experience violence and discrimination, how they are impacted by structures of power and oppression. In this vein, we have continuously advocated for the recognition of diversity and inclusion at the Commission of the Status of Women, including within the agreed conclusions this year. As such, we have also highlighted the importance of meaningful involvement of civil society organizations in all areas of the CSW, as civil society organizations bring in this diverse input, reflecting the lived experiences of all women and girls around the world. From Outright's perspective, this is also vitally important for LGBTIQ communities, as we know that folks face a multitude of violence and discrimination based on their real or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics, which in turn negatively affects their ability to participate in all facets of life. Unfortunately, once again, we have seen this year at the CSW that the recognition of diverse women and girls and people have been an issue of contention, seen through the pushback against language around diversity, such as women and girls and all their diversity within the agreed conclusions negotiations. And we're quite worried that this aspect of inclusion will once again be overlooked in the final outcome document. We hope that in the remaining time of negotiations, member states emphasize and ensure inclusion and the recognition of diversity throughout the agreed conclusions, and civil society organizations, such as the ones represented here today and within the Women's Rights Caucus, continue to be ready and willing to contribute to this process. So with that, Shannon, that's the end of my remarks, and I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sahar. I'm now going to turn it over to Pamela Martin Garcia. She's the advocacy advisor with Casa Fusa and Vecinas Feministas. And she is going to share some perspectives about sexual and reproductive health and rights in these negotiations. Pame, please.
Gracias, Shannon.
Thank you, Shannon. For us, it is key to protect the rights and sexual and reproductive health and rights so that women and girls can freely select what to do with our bodies, free of violence and discrimination, so that they can participate in public life. The lack of access in SRHR, which we must remember that they must be quality and equal and with inclusion, can affect the life of women. So this is usually seen disproportionate in the lives of girls and women. That is why the inclusion of SRHR is vital in the results document so that we can ensure the rights of girls and women in the participation in public life. In order to ensure that the rights of women and girls throughout their life is crucial to be able to address and eliminate gender violence. Finally, I want to share with you that in my region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, is not present in the Bureau of the CSW this year. But let's recall that the Bureau is the coordination space for CSW, where each region is able to elect a member state to represent them. This year, that chair was empty because the region did not assume that responsibility, which is crucial for decision making. In a region, especially where poverty has the face of a girl and a woman who have no access to health and SRHR, and who are usually the most affected by gender violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. We will now turn to Maria Antonieta Alcalde Castro from Ipas. She is the country director of Ipas Mexico, and she will say more on sexual and reproductive health and rights.
Thanks, Shannon. And I think like the issue of sexual and reproductive health and rights is crucially central to the topic that we are addressing at this session of the CSW. The world won't be able to realize the full potential of women's civic engagement and public participation if women are destined to be pregnant all the time. I mean, we need to have access to sexual and reproductive health services and rights to ensure that women can actually participate. And this is something that was discussed in many panels during the session and during the negotiations, but we still do not see that commitment in the document. We need to ensure that this document increase and make an emphasis on the commitment to comprehensive sexuality education, access to comprehensive health, sexual and reproductive health services, including family planning, and access to safe and legal abortion. And we need to remember that more than 25 years ago in Beijing, governments made a commitment on all these issues, including abortion, when they committed to ensure that abortion should be legal, must be safe when legal. And they committed themselves also to review their legislations to advance on the right of abortion. So we already have a commitment that was made 25 years ago. And it's incredible that now we are still facing the same issues when actually we are living within a pandemic that has made access to sexual and reproductive health services and access to abortion even more pressing and needed. And we want to call the governments to fulfill the promise that they made 25 years ago by making abortion services accessible to women. For example, by exploring new technologies and using telehealth and telemedicine for these services. So again, it is incredible that 25 years ago, we're still discussing the same when we already have a commitment. So we hope that we have stronger document on these issues. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maria Antonieta. Now we're going to hear from Memory Kachambwa. She's the Executive Director of FEMNET, the African Women's Development and Communication Network. And she's going to talk a little bit more about the structural issues facing women and girls and some of the barriers to participation and leadership. So please go ahead, Memory.
Thank you so much. I think the theme of this year has really come at a time where we are facing a lot in terms of issues around women's leadership, as well as violence against women. And I think what we have seen is the need to address the structural issues that we have been raising even pre-COVID. We have seen a lot in terms of the underfunding of the public services, of the social protection services. We have also seen that there isn't a lot in terms of using an intersectional approach. I think one of the things that we also see is a lot of increasing opposition in terms of the ideals of our feminist movements, issues to do with colonialism, neoliberalization, the issues of how the spaces are becoming more racial, addressing issues of class, addressing, issues that have to do even with issues around climate justice, and how all these issues intersect, and how we've also seen a lot of this agenda being taken over, and a lot of rhetoric around supporting women's movements, supporting feminist movements, the gender equality agenda, and the commitments we saw in Beijing 25 years ago. I think I also just want to say that, to reiterate what Shannon said, to say, in as much as we have seen an increase in terms of the digital platform allowing us to have more numbers, more access, but we've also seen how this is, it presents a connectedness between women and girls with opportunities to talk back to power, to mobilize across time and space, to be heard and make a difference. but this is not what is being presented. There's increase in cyber violence, access from the African continent, in as much as we have seen more people, but we find that this has also shrunk the space in the way we are negotiating, even in this CSW, where we have not had as much access to even influence our government delegations and also have access to some of those rooms. I think just to end is to say, is to also ask some fundamental questions around what we need to do in terms of how do we continuously, when we talk of women's leadership, how do we work more closely with political parties? How do we continue to ask our governments to adopt a more gender transformative approach in their policy making and decision making processes? But most importantly, how do we continue preventing and funding the prevention of violence, because the evidence is there, and particularly in private spaces? And how do we create an inclusive, participatory, responsive, as well as democratic spaces for women and girls to take up decision-making spaces, but to also make sure that they enjoy their rights, looking at the 25 years of Beijing that we are coming from and the Generation Equality Forum that we are moving into. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Memory. And again, that whole question of access is one thing that we definitely need to grapple with as we move forward, especially since it's likely that what we've experienced this year is going to continue in some form or other in the future. And so addressing those critical questions in the shrinking space for civil society is really key. So I'm going to turn it over now to Marevic Bing Parcon. Bing is the Executive Director of the Women's Global Network for Reproductive Rights. And she'll be talking about women human rights defenders and some of our key priorities there.
Right,
Bing?
thank you. Yes, thank you, Shannon, and thank you to the colleagues at the Women's Rights Caucus. Yes, I'd like to draw our attention to the women human rights defender situation. And 25 years after Beijing, women's rights are human rights. But now, as we see, human rights are under attacks across the globe. It remains so there's that imperative that, we have to see the vulnerabilities of human rights defenders, specifically the women human rights defenders who are fighting for the right related to gender, to sexuality, and advocating for stronger social protection systems and greater access to public services. And we've seen right now that across contexts across the world, state actors and non-state actors are engaging threats, intimidation, harassment, attacks, reprisals, and even killings of women human rights defenders and activists. And even during this COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen the incidents of domestic violence, physical attacks and killings, online harassment, derogatory and stigmatizing language becoming more and more frequent and being used against the human rights defenders, specifically the women human rights defenders. And even, within the pretext of the pandemic measures, we have seen, in my context particularly, how this pandemic is being used to curtail the civil rights of activists to protest and to demand better responses from the government. And there are also accounts, for example, of attacks against those who are engaging in community relief efforts. And a number of states are also getting in the way of support from international community by directly blocking funding and intervening the usual grant processes by introducing additional requirements in the name of so-called anti-terrorism efforts. And we have seen as well that the human rights defenders are exposed to specific risk and challenges. We know this for a fact because our work is towards, changing inequality in a society. And we are facing multiple forms of discrimination and violence. And so this CSW 65, we are really dismayed. I am really dismayed that some states repeatedly seek to delete references to various forms of civil society organizing. We enjoin member states that, provide specific and appropriate protection to WHRDs and ensure the enabling environment and spaces for us to defend our rights and to allow access to decision making and spaces and processes, and to ensure access to essential resources. Like I said, there are already blocking of grants towards defending human rights. And given that decision is focused on eliminating gender violence, it is also a must that we emphasize that WHRDs are especially vulnerable because of what we do, what we fight for. And there are already violent attacks towards WHRDs and even their families. And one of which is, I am, very much close to this example, is that there's this jailed Filipino activist, Reyna Menasino, whose plea to the Philippine justice system to provide care to her months-old baby had fallen to deaf ears and has resulted in the death of her child. And as it stands, there's no clear reference in the current draft to the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination that WHRDs face. And we see that in the version that we have in this morning. Across the Asia Pacific that I am where I am now, particularly in Myanmar, in India, in Kashmir, West Papua, in the Philippines, where I am based, Thailand, Hong Kong, women human rights defenders are on the front lines of various movements responding to the alarm of human rights situations in our countries. That's why we are calling the governments and the state to protect the human rights defenders, stop criminalizing dissent, stop the threats, stop the attacks, intimidation, harassment, reprisal, imprisonments, and killings. And we've seen a lot of this. And so we are actually really, this is very concerning situation that we are in right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bing. And the reason why we're bringing these issues to this conference today is because these are both priorities of the Women's Rights Caucus, but some of the really critical issues that governments have not yet been able to agree to, and which we need to see in the agreed conclusions for it to be a successful outcome for women, girls, transgender and gender non-binary people around the world. I am going to now pass it to my colleague, Befu Sheka, from Women. She's the advocacy coordinator at Women for Women's Human Rights, Turkey. And she's going to be speaking about the Istanbul Convention and commitments to address gender-based violence. Befu, please.
Thank you very much, Shannon. Hi, everyone. The global attacks of anti-gender and anti-rights groups against human rights systems have escalated with the pandemic. The anti-gender movements are trying their best to take away the gains with regards to women's and LGBTI rights. Feminist and LGBTI movements in authoritarian states are being targeted and criminalized. The attacks against the concept of gender on the basis of protecting traditional family values have become a widespread discourse in trying to legitimize the controversies against the Istanbul Convention in Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Turkey, and elsewhere. International conventions, human rights systems, and multilateral spaces are under the threat of an immense backlash. We have been experiencing this at CSW for some years. Some groups have been constantly trying to weaken women's struggle on gender equality and bodily autonomy. Today, Turkey's decision to withdraw from the convention might have a domino effect on other countries where the convention has been contested by right-wing groups. International human rights conventions, mechanisms, and spaces are more important than ever in a time in which all our rights and so far made progress is at risk. The anti-gender ideology is trying to weaken states' accountability on their human rights obligations while consolidating power on nationalistic discourses with regards to multilateralism. Feminist and LGBTIQ movements in the world have made lots of achievements, but the backlash in both the global South and the global North shows us that we always have to be alert and can't take our rights and progress for granted. Nevertheless, as we have seen in this process, our global solidarity is powerful than ever. The belief in an equal present and future where all forms of violence and discrimination based on gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, race, ethnicity has come to an end is also stronger than ever. We know that we have never walked alone and we will never walk alone. Thank you, Shannon and all. That's all I have to say.
Thank you so much. So now we will open it up for questions. And so I have one question here, is where do you all hope to see progress in the upcoming outcome document for the CSW? What are some of the key things that you would consider a success? Bing, go ahead. And then Sahar, go ahead. Bing, please, go ahead.
Yes, what I'd like to see as the outcome of this CSW 65 is that there's no more regression. Please, no more regressions. We have seen over and over how we fought as feminists in these spaces. We fought every language, every word there are, but we have seen over and over each year the regressions and the push and pull. And I'm really appealing that this shouldn't be happening anymore. I mean, 25 years on after Beijing, where are we now? I mean, let's move on, and that's my appeal. And this is what my hope to this CSW 65.
Sahar, please.
Thanks so much, Shannon. And yeah, just as a quick remark, hopefully, and we're still holding on to that hope, there's still time that these agreed conclusions will be more progressive in the way that they acknowledge the diverse communities that we make up, that they acknowledge the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and violence that we face on a daily basis across the globe, and the way that that's also contained in stronger language when it comes to labor rights, when it comes to education, when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights, and so on and so forth. So we're still holding on to that hope, but we need to see progress in all of these areas because all of these areas affect us in multiple and intersecting ways.
Thanks, Sahar. Another question from the participants, from Edith Lederer. Do you expect CSW to approve a document? What if they don't agree? And we hear Russia has been a strong opponent on many issues. And so does anybody wish to comment on the state of the negotiations and expectations there? Please, Maria Antonieta.
Of course, we expect to have a document. I mean, CSW, it's a critical space for the global movement for women's rights, for the governments to advance the agenda. And it would be really very regrettable not to have a document. But we don't have just any document. Like, I mean, there is no space for any regression here. We want to see a document that, as Sahar said, recognize the diversity. And when we're talking about participation, the world benefits from having the diversity of voices. It's really concerning to see that, no, these populations should not be included. Like, we've been talking about women and girls, for example, and how adolescents and girls are not included properly. And we want to ensure that their voices are heard. Like, so we are still working with the governments. I mean, like, not just expecting, but actually working to ensure that, like, that the Commission have great conclusions. But we make a call to the governments to actually like open the space for a progressive document. This is a moment, actually, I mean, with the pandemic and with the situations that we're living with, the violations of women's rights, I mean, like Me Too, the Green Wave, this is the moment really to leap, I mean, kind of upon the standards, and the standards are very high. So we're still hopeful that we will have a document, and we hope that this document could include this, all the issues that we address here. But we know that our fight doesn't finish there. So we will be here next year, and we will be talking to our governments at the national level, and we will be at the Generation Equality Forum. This is only one step. So we know also that we won't get everything that we want, but that's gonna give us more strength to keep working for what we know it's right. That is the comprehensive women's rights agenda.
We have another question about the
Il y a
negotiations.
une autre question sur la négociation.
I'm hearing the French and the English channel.
Oui, j'entends le français et l'anglais, les deux.
Okay. So could you share some of the key tension points in the negotiations? And in fact, the issues that we've touched on today are key tension points within the negotiations: sexual and reproductive health and rights, intersectionality, diversity, the role of women's human rights defenders in protecting them from violence and attacks as some of the key areas of controversy. So I wonder, do any of you feel that you want to comment on which member states are pushing for progressive language? Where are some of the opposition points of opposition coming from? Please go ahead.
Okay.
Jaime, please.
Gracias, Shannon.
Thank you, Shannon. Regarding the issues that you mentioned and that we have been mentioning throughout this press conference, what's important, and I was reading some of the things in the chat regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and how it is important to keep that link to the pandemic. Not that before the pandemic, we didn't have obstacles to have access to our rights, or that we didn't have the guarantee of participation and violation to our rights, but we were having difficulties with having access. But this has been become worse, and the women and children are at a more precarious condition. And what we haven't seen is quick reactions from governments to be able to show and bring about solutions to this. The scenario in negotiations has diverse groups, some who support progressive language, like the group of Santiago of Latin America and the Caribbean, made up by some of the countries of the region, not all. Also the European Union, the US is being key. So among other countries, we see Russia, the Holy See, and many other countries that have retracted and positions that are opposed to guarantee and promoting rights.
Does anybody want to add or build on Pamela's
Y a-t-il des autres
comments?
commentaires à ajouter ou
We're
quelque chose
still-
d'autre à ajouter?
We're still hearing the French and the English channel. I will add just a few key points. As Pamela said, there are a number of countries, and these are the countries that tend to year in, year out, push for language that is often regressive, or that would seek to deny women and girls, transgender, non-binary people their rights. In this year in particular, Russia has been very, very vocal and on the front lines. The Holy See has often joined them in positions, but we're also seeing really vocal participation from countries like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Cuba, who have been some of the key blocks of opposition on all of the issues that have been put forward. Women human rights defenders has been opposed by China and some of those countries as well. What we have seen is very strong leadership from a number of Latin American countries, from the Pacific Islands Forum, from many within the African group is a bit of a bridge builder, as well as CARICOM. And what we have seen this year is really strong and vocal return of the United States as a leader and defender of sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender equality, and women's rights more broadly, which is very, very heartening to see. So we don't have agreed conclusions already, which was another question in the chat. We are coming down to the wire in terms of the negotiations. They will be addressed. There will be a resolution one way or the other, and we hope it's with a very, very strong, progressive, forward-looking document tonight. And we expect that in the end, governments will agree to do what's best and what's needed to address gender equality and women's, girls, transgender and gender non-binary people's human rights. We hear, okay, Gabrielle said her question has been answered. What does the panel think about the conclusion of the CSW 65 towards promoting gender parity progress in decision-making? Did it put more discussion and agreement weight on the GBV theme, or justice was done with the focus of female leadership and women in decision-making? Was there enough focus on the question of women's and girls' participation and decision-making in public life? Was the balance struck there? Do any of our panelists want to take that on?
I can comment, Shannon. I think one of the things that was quite concerning with the theme is that women's leadership and participation on its own does intersect with issues around violence against women and girls and participation in public life. But we saw these are themes which are very heavy in their own respect, and to really look at issues on safety within ending violence within the public space, I think that should have really had been maybe a separate theme as well, because the issues in terms of women's access to public spaces for them to feel safe in its own requires its own, but also I think the layer of how with COVID, we also saw an increase in violence against women and girls, including even gender non-conforming communities, and how that was not, really did not get enough attention in terms of really looking at the different intersectionalities and unpacking how it manifests and what the governments and the member states can do. But I think also maybe just to say, it was also quite disappointing, really. I think we were quite concerned from some of the African governments who were not progressive enough in terms of really pushing for some of what they had agreed on in terms of their own ministerial and consultations, you know, how we saw them now shifting and changing during some of the negotiations, or being in the middle, or actually being absent in some of the negotiation spaces as well, or starting to oppose some of the progressive language. And I think it's a call for African governments also to step up and to rekindle and to support the spirit of African women's movement and some of the ideals in that respect.
Thanks, Memory. Does anybody else want to comment on this particular question? Great. There were some questions about the impact of COVID. And so I wanted to make sure that that question was answered. One of our participants mentioned that what opportunity is there as we are responding to COVID-19 and to the health crisis in order to address gender equality and women's human rights? What are some of the impacts that we've seen? But what specifically can also be done with regard to sexual and reproductive health and rights? And so Maria Antonieta, I wonder if you want to say a few words, and then I think I'll ask Memory just to say a few words on that as well.
Sure. I mean, like, of course, the COVID pandemic and all the policies related to it had affected everyone. But women are really highly, I mean, like, I'm one of the population that has been actually highly affected in every aspect, like the economic aspect, the social aspect, the health aspect. But when it comes to sexual reproductive health and rights, what we are seeing is one that in many countries, when it comes to gender-based violence, women are trapped with their aggressors. They are, I mean, we know that many of the violence against women comes from people closer, from family members closer to their families, and so they're trapped there. So there's a lot to do on prevention of gender-based violence, but also addressing gender-based violence. And many of these aggressions may result on unwanted pregnancy. So access to services will be crucial. Also, we know that families are having to prioritize about, and women within families, if they spend money on medicines and food, or if they will have to give off things, and things that couples and women are giving up are contraception, and that it comes like a luxury, and governments needs to ensure that this contraception doesn't become a luxury for women, to ensure that they have access, and they have easy access. And that's where, for example, approaches like telemedicine could be really helpful, ensuring that women do not have to go to the clinic or to spend a lot of money, and they have access. And then this reduction in the use of contraceptives will increase the need for abortion services. And that's the other area where we think governments could explore possibilities, like many governments, or some governments are doing, very few actually, on using telemedicine and telehealth to bring the services closer to women. We know that when it comes to abortion, it's something that women can self-manage at home very safely. So governments should provide this service using platforms that, one, reduce the pressure of this service within the health system, because then you don't have to have women coming to the clinics. You don't put them in risk to being infected. You can deliver at home. So I feel that there is still a lot of work. Many governments have not declared sexual reproductive health services as essential services, and that's kind of point one of reaction to the pandemic when it comes to women's health. So I think that there's a lot to do in the reaction to the pandemic. There's a lot to think about how to reduce the pressure to the health system by promoting telehealth services and exploring these new possibilities.
Great. Memory, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I totally agree with Maria, and maybe just to add is that an issue around gender data. I think there were huge gaps in terms of COVID, the importance of collecting gender data, which will help in terms of informing even the response. I think another issue is also around the stimulus and the response plans, some which really didn't have the participation and the consultation of women, and also which were not targeted at ending issues like gender-based violence, which we saw was really one of the things that really came out on issues around COVID. So I think those are some of the issues to consider. And I think the issue around teenage pregnancies, the increase around teenage pregnancies, and the plans in terms of getting most of the girls to go back to school. We saw, for example, in Kenya, it's estimated that at least 40,000 young girls became pregnant. Teenage pregnancies were recorded, and this is actually underreporting when you really think of the
abortions which were not successful, the botched abortions, when you also think of some of the families, you know, who will be hiding and things like that. So there's still underreporting, there's still unrecognition of the whole intersecting nature in terms of issues also to do with sexual reproductive health and rights, and how COVID should have really been an opportunity to redress some of these issues, but we're not seeing a lot in terms of addressing, especially the huge inequalities that has been created. In fact, we are seeing the richer getting richer. The Oxfam report really outlined the increase in the inequality gaps as well. Yeah, so maybe just those to add.
Thanks, Memory. And I think Bing wanted to add something about vaccine access in particular. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Shannon. Two things. One is on the vaccine, and the second is also on the rise of the number of unsafe abortions, specifically in the context where I am in. Right now, we have a new data that says that there's 17,000 induced abortion happening every month since the lockdown, and we are still in the lockdown right now. We came in the second phase of the lockdown. And what I think really is that with the rise of unintended pregnancies during this period, plus unsafe abortions, this is also the time where the government also has to think of how to remove the barriers to access safe abortion, specifically the legal barriers. And here in the Philippines, we've started the decriminalization of abortion campaign, and what we're looking at is that there's the need to support that, specifically in this period where there is the spike in the number of unsafe abortions and induced abortion. And secondly, in the issue on vaccine, and in the context that I am in, there's always been an issue on the access on the vaccine, and a question where how this is actually also further the marginalization of others, because what we've seen right now is that there's no clear as to when really are the marginalized sectors going to get vaccines. And I don't know how is it, how's the rollout in other countries, but in my context right now, we have seen that this is actually already, we've seen this disparity around this. Who is actually getting right now are in not the frontliners even, but our politicians and everyone that are in the,
Thanks so much, Bing. We are getting close to time, and there are a number of questions that have been asked that we probably will not get to. I am going to ask Sahar to really quickly respond to the question of the rise of anti-transgender rhetoric and the fact that there's been a lot of discussion this year at the Commission on the Status of Women about the rights of transgender people. And I wanted to see if you wanted to add something about the Women's Rights Caucus's position and what we're pushing for with regard to this.
Yes, thanks so much, Shannon, and I appreciate the question. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that there is a rise in anti-rights, anti-gender narratives in these spaces and globally in conversations when it comes to women's rights and gender equality. And just to quickly, speak from the perspective of the Women's Rights Caucus and as a member of the Women's Rights Caucus, I think our effective strategy is to counter these positionings by really staying close to what the actual argument is and breaking down these false narratives created by these groups that stick to this very, essentialist view of what gender is. And instead, we speak to, women and girls as inclusive as trans women, but also talk about gender more expansively to include the experiences of trans and gender diverse individuals that don't identify as women and girls, but nonetheless face gender-related or gender-based violence and discrimination, because the fact is that they transgress norms that are placed onto us as individuals in society by the patriarchy. So I think it's very effective in that the Women's Rights Caucus takes the approach of holding true to what the issue is when it comes to gender-related discrimination and violence and how that is carried out through norms and not to this false description of how it's attributed to biological anatomy.
Thank you so much, Sahar. So I've got 3 questions that I'm going to use to wrap. So I'm going to ask for rapid fire responses from each of our panelists. The first is, do you think that there is a risk of not having agreed conclusions this year? And how big is that? Should we be worried about it? So Sahar, please.
I want to say no. I think, of course, we have to say that there is a slight risk, and that we are down to the wire. It's Friday. We don't have a document at this time, where usually we would be at least very close to a document. But again, we are in a different world. Things are virtual and they're going to take a little bit more time. But I think I'm hopeful, and I hope that my colleagues on this call are hopeful that we will get to an important and progressive document that moves the needle forward.
Pamela, please.
Gracias, Shannon.
Thank you, Shannon. Along the lines of what Sahar was saying, without a doubt, we are a little discouraged, but we also know that we to double our efforts for next year and for what's coming for generation equality. We must be able to keep moving forward and to have governments and states more committed to human rights. Thank you.
Maria Antonieta.
Well, there's always a risk, but we will have to, like, I completely align with what Sahar and Pamela said. And I think that we have to remember that the member states and the organizations that are pushing for not having an agreement is because they also want to undermine the CSW as a whole. This has been a space that it's a women's space, and we need to protect that, and we need to ensure that it's relevant. So this is not only about not agreeing this time. This is also about undermining these spaces that we have built with a lot of effort. So we need to be mindful of that, and we need to see who's behind, what's the overall agenda for this. So we are hopeful, and not only hopeful, we're working hard to have meaningful, agreed conclusions, as we always are. Thank you.
Thank you. And Nadi just clarified that her question. She said, what would be the problem? What would be the impact if there is no agreed conclusions? So I'm going to ask Bing, Memory, and Befu to respond to that part of the question. So please go ahead, Bing.
Right. So what would be the impact? I think the impact is just it gives us more reason to persist, I would say. If there's no agreed conclusion, it gives us more reason to pressure the national government, to also work hard with them to be able to have a good conclusion next year. I mean, yeah, and there's always that risk, but I would not also say that it's the end of it. It gives us more reason to persist, I would say, as feminists, as activists.
Memory?
Yeah, I think the risk will be telling, to say, what do we need to do as a movement? So I think is to really galvanize our efforts in terms of really pushing, and also maybe seeing how do we push the local, and if the process is not working at a global, how do we also make sure that our CSW is being localized, and how can we make sure that it happens? I mean, just knowing that the document is almost 9 p.m. here in Nairobi, where I am, but it means that from now on, we need to activate our team. We will have to start pushing the Africa group to say now, for just to make sure, I mean, to come back with an agreed conclusion. But I just wanted to say something, Shannon, to say, I think one key takeaways is that it's positive, that we might be, the virtual has opened us to be able to speak maybe to groups which we would not ordinarily reach. So we're probably not talking to each other. And that also, that I think another thing is that how do we really get what is coming out to be meaningful and to be practical and to be implemented on the ground?
Thanks, Memory. Befu.
Well, of course, it will be heartbreaking, but we will be continuing on our struggle to, make the best of the multilateral processes for the advancement of gender equality, LGBTI rights, and we will be struggling more and more to have the agreed conclusions at its best. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a question, I just want to touch on it quickly about the impact of COVID on cis and trans sex workers. And I will say the Women's Rights Caucus is supportive of the human rights of sex workers and has been advocating as part of the response and part of the COVID response to ensure that informal workers and those who are often marginalized and left behind are centered and responded to within COVID responses. And that is a priority for us. So another question quickly for the panelists as we wrap it up. How do we continue the momentum? And this is the last question. How do we continue the momentum from this CSW into the Generation Equality Forum, which will be happening next week in Mexico and at the end of June in Paris? What is the opportunity there and how do we make those connections? Please, we'll start the other way this time. So I'm going to ask you to go first. Please.
Well, we are going to carry on this commitment to our advocacy in the Forum of Generation Equality in Mexico. We see that there is a very powerful global solidarity in terms of feminism and LGBTIQ rights. And I think that we are going to have the best of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Memory?
I think it's really building and leveraging on the energy and the momentum that we have seen with CSW. I think the Generation Equality Forum is an opportunity where we as civil society are leading. So I think claiming our leadership role to make it a really civil society driven process, despite the challenges. I think we can continue with the same momentum, but in particularly bringing in particularly the younger generation and making sure that young people have access, they have a voice, and they're also able to exercise their power in the spaces leading to Generation Equality Forum.
Bing?
Yeah, GAF is a reason to celebrate. We will celebrate our diversity, our activism, but at the same time, let's also make it as a venue for us to amplify our calls, our demand, bring this CSW, whatever is the loose ends in the CSW to the GAF, and claim the space for women's rights. And we have seen how there's already, co-opting of our spaces. We have to claim that and no to pink washing in any spaces that we are in.
Thank you, Bing. Maria Antonieta.
Well, I think that we have seen in CSW how hard it is to make political commitments, and being someone who has followed the CSW sessions for the past 20 years, you have all these struggles and the tensions. And for us, but it's also a place where we get together and we see what are the difference, where is the new agendas that we need to push harder. And I feel that we take all that energy and we're going to take it first to at the national level. And I think that that's very important. The connection between what is happening at the global level and the national, and for those governments that has been supportive to ensure that their words have meaning at the national level, and for those ones who haven't been supported, to bring those, their lack of commitment to the movement at the national level. So there is a cost of not supporting women. And then on the Generation Equality Forum, I think this is a moment to ensure, as Mary was saying, that this is a moment of celebration, but also it's a moment to reinforce commitment, to review the agenda that we made 25 years ago and to update it and to see where we haven't been moving as fast as we need. And there is a moment, I mean, I expect that Mexico would be like reviewing the overall agenda, kind of tuning the agenda, and then Paris to be a moment of commitments. We want to hear member states, we want to hear all the presidents, high level of vision, making real commitments on what they're planning to do on the women's rights agenda and how are they planning to do it. And I think that that's very important. We want to celebrate, but we also want to make commitments, and we promise that we're going to make them accountable for those commitments.
Thank you, Maria Antonieta. Pamela.
Gracias.
Thank you. The CSW reviews and supports the Beijing agenda that we're supporting ourselves with the support of other actors. Generation equality is a great tool, as my colleague said, not only for celebration, but what needs to be done to strengthen the compliance with commitments, the implementation of commitments, and to make a reality everything that we have been working for, promoting, pushing, negotiating. We need so much more to be able to generate equality and also to establish our rights.
Thanks, Pame. And Sahar, the final word is yours.
Yeah, and not much more to add, but to echo everything that my brilliant colleagues have said, and really just to say that the multitude of things that we have been discussing in this call, they won't be negotiations in the Generation Equality Forum. They will be the baseline, and we can only move forward from there. And what we're going to do at Generation Equality Forums is to really push forward and get solid commitments around these ideas and issues that we're speaking about. So I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. And so with that, we are right at time. And I see there's one last question. Is there a document that has been adopted? No, it's still under negotiation. So we are watching closely. We're hoping to see a very strong outcome, a document that addresses the issue that we've been discussing today. And we're planning to take them to the Generation Equality Forums to make sure that they become operationalized and acted upon, not just words, action. So thank you, everybody, for participating today. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you.